Well, good afternoon and welcome to our first Frank Rhodes lecture of 2022. We're delighted that you are all here and hope the year has been off to a good start for you. And this is a wonderful thing for us to do in January, to have a thought-provoking speaker to help us challenge ourselves as we look forward into 2022 and beyond. Our lecture is in honor of Frank Rhodes, who was the 9th president of Cornell University from 1977 to 1998. In his 18 years at Cornell, Dr. Rhodes made huge contributions to the Cornell community, but we recognize him also as an influential voice and a champion for transformation in US higher education. I'm sure some of us in our community have read his book, Creation of the Future, where he laid out a lot of really disruptive ideas that are yet to be realized. One of the things that I picked up on as I was reading up on him was what he said in his inaugural speech. He talked about research universities working together to become a new hope for mankind. And I think in 45 years since then, we are still working on how universities can work together to become a new hope for mankind. So it continues to be something that we can all aspire to. Our lecture series at ASU began in 2011. Dr. Crow's vision was that we create a platform and an opportunity for us to continue challenging ourselves as our institution evolves into the future. Our speakers represent scholars and leaders who challenge the status quo and challenge us to rethink and reimagine everything we know about higher education. And we are delighted that in Dr. Daniel Markovits, we have such a speaker here today. I'm going to turn it over to President Crow to introduce Dr. Markovits, but a couple of housekeeping things before we do that. The lecture will be about 20 to 25 minutes long, after which we will have a Q&A and a discussion. Please add in all your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I will do my best to take in as many questions as we possibly can, but please start adding your questions as soon as they occur to you. So with that, I am going to welcome Dr. Markovits, but turn it over to President Crow for a more formal introduction.
Thank you, Manu. It's really a pleasure today, even an exciting day to get Daniel over here. Daniel is true to the spirit of what we're hoping to do with this lecture series, which is challenge the status quo. Just for the sake of doing that, we think there's value in that to the extent that we can disrupt the basic models of higher education and the design of higher education, and to the extent that we can initiate redesign, that is the continuous redesign and design of new ways for higher education to move forward. And so Daniel is, I don't know him well enough to call him a weirdo, but he's a little bit of a weirdo in the sense that he's a mathematician, econometrician, trained in math, trained in Yale undergraduate in math, LSE and econometrics, Oxford in terms of a PhD. And then he decides to go back to law school. So that's a very, very complex path. But then he's taken all of that fantastic education that he received and his intellect that he has nurtured, and then he's really gone after the really complicated things. So what does it mean, as he talked about in a commencement speech to Yale Law School in 2015 that I remember reading about, and then I went and looked it up and watched it several times, to really go at this notion of the impact of meritocracy on our society. What does it mean? Where are we going? How does a meritocracy become the replacement mechanism for the aristocracy? So Daniel doesn't realize, but we were intellectual brothers in the following sense. That is, I've been worried that we're like returning back to England. We're going back to pre-revolutionary America, and it's all being done by institutions. And so Daniel spent time in England, time in the United States, studied over there, born over there, and now he's risen to prominence at the Yale Law School, holding an endowed chair there, and teaching across a wide range of subjects. But then he put out a fantastic book on the meritocracy trap, which then I read, and then immediately after looking at it, I was able to get him on Zoom because it was easier to travel around just on electrons. And what I found was just a brilliant, disruptive, I mean that in a respectful sense, disruptive intellect. And so Daniel, it's really fantastic. You've come all the way over to Arizona. You've spent a day here with us, and you're going to give us your thinking on, what's really going on as we're still trying to struggle for our democracy to work. So here at ASU, where you've gotten a sense that we're really doing everything that we can to build a new kind of university, we need your ideas, your intellect, and this angle that you're taking here, which is that you found a flaw in what's happened in the macro design of higher education and even the micro design at institutional levels. We talked a little bit about that yesterday when we had a chance to talk yesterday. So we're very excited for you to be here. You're very much in the spirit of Frank Rhodes, very much in the spirit of the New American University. So welcome to the lecture series and welcome to ASU.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And thank you also to everybody, Chelsea, especially to you for arranging this trip. I have to say, although much of what I'm going to talk about is a diagnosis of a depressing condition, it's hard to spend a couple of days at ASU and not be optimistic. This is an incredibly exciting university right now. It's a great pleasure to be here for that reason. It's a great pleasure, Michael, that you invited me. It's also a great pleasure. This is the Frank Rhodes lecture. Some of you, I think, knew Frank Rhodes. I did not. But my understanding is that he believed that the moral character of education is emancipatory and also universally emancipatory, but that he also worried that elite US American universities, partly because they're pursuing exclusivity rather than excellence, are cutting against the universally emancipatory character of education. And what I'm going to say in the next 25 minutes or so is really an elaboration, both with theory and data, of that intuition to try to diagnose the condition that we're in and why things have gone wrong in the particular way that they have. I have some views about cure, and I won't be shy about sharing them in the question and answer, but I know that at ASU, you all have lots of views about cure too. And so I will focus on diagnosis in the prepared part of the talk. And then I hope we can have a back and forth, not just about what's gone wrong and about whether my diagnosis is correct, but also about what we might do about it and how we might get ourselves out of the situation that we are in. So we are going to start in a relatively familiar place, which is that economic inequality has been rising, and in particular, high-end economic inequality has been rising. That is to say, the share of total income here, but also the share of total wealth captured by the richest households, in the conventional telling now the richest 1%. And what this slide shows and what countless other data points have shown over time is that the top 1% share today is more than twice as great as it was at the middle of the last century. So gone from a little under 10% to a little over 20%. The US is an extreme case here, but other countries, both wealthy countries and less wealthy and developing countries, show a similar sort of U-shaped trend in the richest households' share of total national income. The details behind this are a little less familiar, and it's important, if one's going to understand what's happened, to get these details right. The old wealthy, the old elite, self-consciously constituted themselves as a leisure class. They were capitalists. They didn't work industriously for a living. Instead, they owned things and mixed what they owned with other people's labor and extracted rents, extracted surplus from other people's work. That's not the new rich. The rich work harder than they used to, and they even work harder nowadays than the middle class and the poor. If you look here at the fraction of prime-age, non-self-employed working men to work over 50 hours a week, as recently as 1979, if you were in the top fifth of the hourly wage distribution, you were only about 2/3 as likely as someone in the bottom fifth to work over 50 hours a week. By 2006, the highest paid fifth of workers had become more than twice as likely as the lowest paid fifth to work over 50 hours a week. The reason for this is not that the middle class and the poor don't want to work. Rather, it's that the economy has been restructured so that it no longer creates enough jobs for non-elite workers. Over the past 40 years or so, the share of jobs in the economy that are associated with middle class, mid-skilled work, that's the routine jobs in the middle of this slide, has just fallen through the floor. While at the same time, the number of jobs available to elite workers, the non-routine cognitive workers, had exploded. So we live in a labor market now that is creating too much work for the elite and not enough work for the middle class. The trend goes all the way up the income scale. The top 1% of US American workers by income nowadays works about 8 hours a week more than it did in 1950. Even as the bottom 60% work about 8 hours a week less. So that is a shift of work effort away from mid-skilled middle-class workers and towards elite superordinate workers of about 16 relative hours a week, or 2 regulation work days a week. And again, the reason for this is not that people don't want to work, it's that the economy does not make the jobs that are needed for mid-skilled middle-class workers to work remuneratively. The rich also owe their income to their labor. They're no longer capitalists or rentiers. Instead, they're a superordinate working class. And one of the reasons this has happened is that inside jobs, work has been restructured so that when people who are super skilled and elite work alongside middle-class workers, the elite wages have exploded and the middle-class workers' wages have stagnated. These are just the ratios of wages, of incomes, of different types of workers who sit in the same building in 1960 and again today. And you can see that today, the rich workers are just getting paid much, much, much more than the middle-class workers are relative to how much more they were paid at the middle of the last century. If you want to know who's in the 1%, chase down elite workers, finance sector professionals, vice presidents and above at S&P 1500 firms, elite management consultants, partners at the most profitable law firms, and specialist medical doctors collectively constitute more than half of the 1%. These are degree-having superordinate workers. Also, the 1% owes most of its income to its own labor today. In 1960, the richest 1% got only about 1/3 of its income from labor. By 2000, that had become 3/4. So if you want to know, to go back to the earlier slide that I showed about why it is that the top 1% share of national income has exploded, the answer isn't that there's a shift of income away from labor and towards capital. Rather, is that there's a shift away from mid-skilled middle-class workers and in favor of super-skilled, superordinate elite workers. So that makes it natural to ask, well, who are these elite workers? How do they get that way? And the story there, and here we get to some of Frank Rhodes's concerns, some of ASU's concerns, and some problems with the US educational system, and in particular, the elite part of the US educational system. This is a story of a massive increase of investment by rich parents in educating rich children, and of an explosion in the gap between what the children of rich parents get invested in their educations and everybody else. So not the middle class poor gap, but the rich middle class gap. School is the place where this happens most dramatically. The top 20 private schools, according to Forbes, spend on average about $75,000 per pupil per year on educating the kids that go there. And over 80% of those kids come from families with over $200,000 a year household income. The national public school average for middle class kids is about $12,000 a year per student, maybe a little bit more now. Notice that the gap between the rich and the middle class kid, which is over $60,000 a year, is 15 times bigger than the gap between the middle class and the poor kid. So this is an elite middle class education gap, produces correspondingly enormous differences in childhood achievement. Over the past 70 years or so, the gap between the academic achievement of high school students at the 90th percentile of the income distribution and the 50th, so the rich middle class gap in blue, has grown enormously, even as the middle class poor gap has stagnated or somewhat decreased. Educational reform is making the poor more able to compete with the middle class, but elite super spending on education is making nobody able to compete with the rich. These are also very large effects. The dashed blue line shows you the white-black educational achievement gap in America over time, and the red line shows you the rich-poor gap. And the startling thing about this slide is that by 2000, the rich-poor gap had grown higher than the white-black gap was in 1954. Well, 1954 was the year Brown against Board of Education was decided. And so what we're seeing now is that economic inequality is producing a bigger gap in childhood educational achievement than apartheid did at mid-century. The middle class rich gap, again, is much bigger than the middle class poor gap. Kids whose parents make over $200,000 a year score on average about 250 points more on the SAT than middle-class kids, even as middle-class kids score only about 125 points more on average than kids at or below the poverty line. This produces a skewed elite. This is the odds of going to college in America as a function of your parents' income rank. It's hard to think of something more striking or distressing than that. Well, this is the quality of the college you go to by your parents' income rank. If you look at the 150 or so most competitive colleges in America, kids from households in the top quarter of the income distribution are overrepresented compared to kids in the bottom quarter by a factor of 14 to 1. In a way, that's not surprising. No society has ever had elite institutions that welcome the poor. But notice that kids from the top quarter are also overrepresented compared to kids from each of the middle two quarters by a factor of about 6 to 1. So the rich are squeezing out not just the poor, but also the broad middle class. At the most elite colleges, at the Ivy Plus institutions, there are typically more kids from parents in the top 1% of the income distribution than the entire bottom half. And if you narrow the tip even finer to Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford, there are more kids from the top 1% than from the bottom 60%. Now, here's a way to think about this. Think about the old elite, the aristocrats that Michael talked about in the introduction. How did they pass privilege down through their generations? Well, they did it by dying and then leaving bequests of physical or financial capital, land, factories, stock portfolios to their children. The new elite passes its privilege down through the generations in a different way, through extravagant educational spending on younger children while the parents are still alive. So you can imagine asking, well, how big of an old style inheritance is the new style inheritance equivalent to? Imagine you take the difference between what's spent on educating a typical 1%er kid and a typical middle-class kid, not a poor kid, a middle-class kid. And imagine that every year that difference is invested in the S&P 500 to be given as an old-fashioned inheritance to the rich child on the death of her parents. That would be north of $10 million per child. That's the extent to which this form of elite education passes privilege down through the generations. Well, that has enormous systematic consequences on opportunity in America and on growth. Meritocracy came to America in the service of equality of opportunity. Self-consciously promoted by reformers who thought that the old elite was sclerotic, stagnant, and unjust, and wanted to break it up to ambitious and capable outsiders. And initially, meritocracy worked exactly as planned. And the reason for this is that the old aristocratic elite, to be blunt, wasn't very hardworking and wasn't very smart. And so when colleges and universities and employers opened up positions based on accomplishment, the most accomplished kids were not the kids of the rich aristocrats. At Yale College in the 60s, if you attended a traditional prep school, you were 3 times less likely to be in an academic honor society than if you attended a public school, because the smartest, best trained kids were the kids from the outside, not from the inside. But what I've just shown you is that the new meritocrats, they were the opposite of the aristocrats. The old aristocrats had little taste and little capacity for training their children. But the new meritocrats have an unmatched capacity for training their children and an insatiable taste for doing so. And what you get is a regime like this, in which your education determines your income. This shows you the relative earnings, the median earnings by education level. And it reveals that just about 7.3% of high school workers over their lifetime will make as much as the median college graduate. And just about little over 1% of high school only educated workers, and only 1 in 6 BA only educated workers will make as much as the median professional school graduate. So super educated people dominate the top jobs I described earlier. And now we are living in a world in which rich kids dominate the super educated people. If you want to know where elites are educated, look at the very top, the most profitable law firms in America, the 5 most profitable law firms. These are law firms with profits per partner of roughly $5 million a year. 4/5 of the most profitable law firm graduated from 5 law schools. This broader survey is astonishing. Half of America's corporate elite, financial leaders, and highest government officials attended just 12 universities. So what you have is a pattern of elite dominance over the best schools and elite dominance over the best jobs, where each reinforces the other. And meritocracy, which was embraced to promote equality of opportunity, has become the single greatest obstacle to equality of opportunity in America. It also hasn't been good for growth. The standard story behind meritocracy is if you allow people to advance based on accomplishment and you make training competitive and let people invest as much as they can and want in education, you'll spur innovation and hard work and growth. But these are the total factor productivity growth data by decade in the US. And if you look, 1950 and 1960 were pre-meritocratic, 1970 was the hinge, and from the 80s onward was post-meritocratic. It sure doesn't look like an explosion of growth. It looks more like stagnation. What's true nationally is also true at the level of the individual household. These slides show you the odds that children will be richer than their parents for the kids who were born in 1940 in blue and the kids who were born in 1980 in red. And then the green slide shows you the drop in the odds of getting richer than your parents. And what's so striking about the green line is that everybody has become less likely to get richer than their parents, but the decline is biggest in the middle class, between roughly the 30th and roughly the 80th percentile of the income distribution. So meritocracy is producing stagnation precisely in the middle of our society. So let me close by just trying to think about how to interpret this. Do we have a model for what's going on? Well, I think we do have a model. It's a model from development economics. There's an old puzzle in development economics, which is that why are some of the societies that are the richest in natural resources, in oil, in gold, in diamonds, in minerals, also extremely poor and unstable? Democratic Republic of Congo has massive mineral reserves and a GDP per capita of $550. When other societies with fewer natural resources or even no natural resources are rich and stable, Singapore, GDP per capita, $60,000. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. Colonialism is a reason for it. Mineral-rich places are attractive targets for barbaric exploitation by European powers. But colonialism isn't going to be all of it. Notice Singapore was also at one point colonized. Another explanation, which economists have hit on, is something they call the resource curse. The idea is that if you are resource rich, you focus your economic arrangements and your social orders on extracting the resources and selling them, drilling, mining, and so on. But extraction produces terrible social and political incentives. It concentrates wealth in landowners. It requires a large class of oppressed workers to do the dangerous and unpleasant work of extraction. It discourages investment in education and the development of a flourishing middle class because the middle class is going to side with the workers against the landowners. So the wealthy don't want it. This undermines democracy. It encourages corruption. It encourages civil war and instability, and slow growth follows. If you look at the data that I've just laid out, the United States has invented an entirely new version of the resource curse. The cursed resource for us isn't mineral wealth. It's not in the ground. It's not oil or gold or diamonds. It's human capital. It's the training and skill of free workers. And what the United States has done is concentrate training, skill, and therefore also income and work in a narrow class of superordinate, super-educated workers who dominate an underemployed and stagnating middle class, and who have restructured our schooling so that they are able to transfer their privilege down through the generations in the way in which the old aristocrats or the petro-billionaires pass their land and their oil reserves down to their children, and also restructured our labor market so that precisely the education that only rich kids can afford is the education that gives you the dominant source of income for the next generation in the superordinate working class. So they create the circumstances in which they can transfer their privilege down through generations. They monopolize privilege, education, and work now in an elite class. And social and economic stratification, undemocratic politics, corruption, low growth, lack of opportunity, all inexorably follow. And that's what we're experiencing in our national social, economic, and political life now. And the situation is really dire. The human resource curse, to speak of a curse, is not to exaggerate. If you look at all of human experience across all space and time, There's only one instance of a society that has had as concentrated privilege, as extremely as the United States has in its 1% today, that's managed to unwind this situation without succumbing to a domestic revolution or to defeat in war at the hands of a foreign enemy. Only one across all of time and space. If there's a glimmer of hope, it's that that society was the United States in 1929. And with that, thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to our conversation.
Daniel, thank you for waking us all up to some really deep inequities in society that we are all aware of, but your analysis of the data gives us some new ways of thinking about this. So I'm going to kick it off with a question that was playing around in my head as you were talking, and then I'm going to take questions from our participants. And again, to our participants, please add in your questions using the Q&A function. So my question is this: what do you think is the role of institutions of higher education in contributing to some of the inequities you're talking about? And maybe we don't paint all institutions of higher education with the same brush, but what's your understanding and analysis of what universities have contributed to the situation?
So let me focus for the moment on the narrow class of the most exclusive and elite universities. And I don't know if I want to draw this as narrowly as only 10 or 20 or 25, but a very narrow set of universities, which are characterized by two features. The first is they're incredibly wealthy. They have enormous endowments and also have enormous amounts of social capital and are plugged into the networks of advantage in broader society. And the second is that the way in which they choose which students to educate is they begin with a number of students. And they don't want to ever admit more than that number of students. And then they rank everybody and pick the students that they want to admit up to that number. So exclusiveness is the central administrative mechanism of admission. What they then do is that they invest enormous amounts of resources in these students. Many of these, by the way, are publicly subsidized resources. So these elite universities are structured as tax-exempt organizations, and their tax exemption amounts to a public subsidy. Princeton's tax exemption amounts to a public subsidy of $100,000 a year per Princeton student per year. In a state in which the local community college gets a public subsidy of only $2,500 per student per year. They educate these students, and at the same time, they both themselves innovate and attract outside innovators that restructure the workplace and the technology of production in order to favor precisely their own students. So if I want to be a little bit self-absorbed, Yale Law School educates a very small number of students, and then our faculty and our graduates invent technologies of law, complicated deal structures, complicated litigation techniques and strategies, doctrines that give litigators enormously control over the way in which a lawsuit progresses, which favor precisely our graduates and thereby increase the economic value of our degree. And so what these universities do is they simultaneously select for and then promote the passage of privilege down through a small number of families and remake work to enable those families to stay distinctively on top. And so I think they have an enormous amount to answer for. My own view is that although it's a very small number of universities and a very small number of students, the macroeconomic effect of this is large, that the incomes are big enough that it actually matters to the broader society rather than just being a local unfairness.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Daniel. So one of the questions we have, and we have a lot of questions coming in, talks about how we disrupt this type of meritocracy that you're talking about. And this is from Paola Sanguinetti. And she asks, is free college education the answer?
Yeah, so I think that there are two ways to disrupt it. One of which is something that I think ASU is thinking about a lot, which is to create a model from outside of this exclusivity-based education system. which has, two features that I know you all emphasize a lot, and a third that I think is really important, that I think is implicit in what you're doing, but which really bears further emphasis. The two features that you emphasize a lot are that you'll educate anybody who's educable, and you will conceive of education in terms that emphasize the production of capacities that have positive social value. And then the third part, which is also important, is it requires remaking the labor market so that graduates who have the kinds of skills that this type of educational institution produces can generate high wages for themselves. Right now, what's happening is that technology is complementing super elite workers and substituting for everybody else, so that we have the ability to replace large numbers of middle managers with C-suite executives, surveillance, and algorithms, right? And we could talk in detail if people are interested about how this has gone in industry after industry after industry. I can describe the details of how that's happened. But it's happened in law, it's happened in management, it's happened in manufacturing, it's happened in retail, it's happened in finance. Finance in 1950 in America was a middle-class industry. Mid-skilled middle-class workers drove it, no more. So that's the first part, which is to disrupt from outside the elite, create a new group of educated people, and labor market conditions that make that kind of education economically viable for people. The other way, though, I think, is to attack the elite. Right now, the exclusive universities and the graduates of these universities are protected by a whole series of political and legal and economic mechanisms. Our tax system dramatically favors super skilled, superordinate workers over mid-skilled workers. Middle-class labor is the highest tax factor of production in our economy today, if you combine income taxes and wage taxes. One of the reasons why is that the Social Security wage tax goes to zero after about $130,000 a year of wage income. Another reason is that lots of elite workers can style their labor income in terms of capital gains through carried interest and such things. So one set of things to do is to restructure the way in which the labor market works to favor mid-skilled workers, change tax systems to disfavor elite workers and favor middle-class workers, change regulatory regimes to disfavor extremes of skill at work and favor middle-class work. And then the other parallel thing to do is to limit the ability of elite educational institutions from preschool through graduate school to be exclusive. Elite private schools and universities that educate small numbers of rich kids should not be taxed as charities. And they should be given a choice: either educate more middle class, more working class students, or lose your tax exempt status. And that should be true for, as I say, preschool through professional school. So there are some beginnings of ways to do this, attacking both sides of the problem at the same time.
So a little bit of the carrot and stick for the elite institutions. Oh, there's a question here from Jackie Martinez about the common understanding of the gap between elite earners and middle class earners relating to exploding compensation for executives and boards and so on, so-called elite of the labor market. And she talks about greed seems to play a role in this area. Is that at all supported in your work? And then how do you see that sort of impacting this meritocracy issue that we're talking about? Right, great. So we have to break that down into different parts. So first of all, greed does play a role. There's no question that greed, and also socially legitimated greed, has made it acceptable and even valorized for elite workers to demand enormous incomes, which are much larger than any consumption interest could justify. The difference to your well-being of making $5 million and $10 million a year is zero. And yet elite workers claw and scratch for the second $5 million. And it takes a lot of work to explain why they would do that, but they do. On the other hand, here's a way in which, my private politics are quite far left, in which I depart from others on the left. There's a temptation to say that these elite incomes are exclusively, or at least dominantly, theft or fraud incomes.
that CEOs control boards and compensation committees and so set their own salaries, that finance workers make so much money because they occupy critical nodes in the financial system and extract rents from everybody else, or just lie and extract fraud premia from everybody else. My view is that that's not quite right. It's not that fraud never happens or rents don't exist, but it's that the bigger part of the explosion of elite incomes should be attributed to the fact that work has been transformed. So let's take CEO pay, for example. If you look at the data, when private equity takes companies private, CEO pay does not go down by very much. Now, private equity people are not altruists. They don't pay CEOs more than the CEOs are worth to the business, and yet they still pay the same wages, roughly. I think the reason for that is that the structure of the American firm makes extravagantly hardworking, extravagantly talented CEOs incredibly valuable to the firm. How does it do that? Well, it used to be American firms were run by middle managers. There were many, many layers of middle management below the CEO, and even production workers, because of unionized lifetime employment, were in a sense middle managers. They managed themselves for the good of the firm over the course of their careers. The US American firm has been restructured so that production workers are increasingly short-term, even subcontracted labor. Middle management has been eliminated in downsizing and right-sizing in the 80s and 90s. And what this means is that CEOs can really control their firm. In the old-fashioned story, the elite executives had limited ability to influence the behavior of the firm, and therefore they weren't worth as much to the firm. On the other hand, the economic returns to management were spread across the entire workforce. In the new story, nobody is a manager except the C-suite people. They are incredibly critical to the profitability of the firm, and they capture all the economic returns to management. And so what you have now is a world in which you have enormous inequality because the job has been restructured to favor the elite. If you accept the economic arrangement, the elite are not engaging in fraud. The problem is structural. And the reason why I emphasize this, even though it's often uncongenial to people on the left, is I think focusing on fraud and rent seeking, as I say, while these effects are real, is to focus on the smaller and easier to attack effect, while neglecting the more profound and substantial effect. And if we're going to get ourselves out of the pickle we're in, we have to attack the structure of work head on, rather than leaving the structure of work as it is and attack individual bad actors.
So you're speaking to a lot of the middle skill jobs that have gone, or the middle skill jobs that we need to reinvent or invent. Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Stephen Tepper about what are you speaking to when you talk about these middle skill jobs? I mean, you referenced middle management and production workers in your comments just now. How else are you envisioning this middle skill job?
Sure. Let me give some examples from different sectors of the labor market, some of which are not going to be intuitive, but which I hope I can render compelling. Let's take a look at healthcare. We have far too many specialist doctors and far too few nurse practitioners, nutritionists, behavioral counselors. If you look at just a subset of healthcare, look at heart health. You know, we can transplant a human heart. We can give someone a mechanical heart. We've just successfully transplanted a pig's heart into a person. But we don't actually know whether it is best for my heart for me to educate gently 7 days a week, moderately 3 days a week, or intensely 1 day a week. We don't know the answer to that question. And we certainly don't know what is the most reliable way to get an ordinary person to educate, to exercise in whatever way is optimal. What's the best nutritional regime for me and for my heart health? Now, if we could answer those questions and had an army of healthcare workers that could interact with every one of us to get us to live in a more heart healthy way, this would be much better for our population heart health than the ability to transplant hearts for people whose hearts have failed. it would also produce a large number of mid-skilled middle-class jobs. Being a nutritionist, being a therapist, being an exercise therapist. These are middle-class, mid-skilled jobs. They are better for society to have more of them, and they create a workforce that is well-paid, doing meaningful and attractive work. In finance, used to be, for example, in home mortgage finance, the central production worker was the loan officer. This was a mid-skilled middle-class worker. This was a person who'd gone to college, but had not gone to Harvard, who lived and worked in the community and whose job it was to assess whether individual loans were providently made, to look at borrowers, to look at houses, to figure out whether that loan was adequately secured and whether the borrower would be able to repay it. That person has been totally de-skilled in our economy, has been replaced by a form filler inner and algorithms. The home loans are now securitized. They're cut up, put into portfolios. And those portfolios are constructed and traded by a small number of super skilled workers. And so what's happened in finance is like what's happened in medicine. We have too many derivatives traders and not enough home loan officers. It turns out, by the way, that the best economic work on the efficiency of finance suggests that the new style of finance is not actually economically more efficient than the old style. So it's not socially better. And you have a small number of Wall Street people who make millions of dollars a year, and you've just eliminated home loan officers from every community in America. These were middle-class, mid-skilled, secure people doing meaningful work for good pay. And so again, re-regulate finance to discourage securitization and to increase the number of banks that originate and then service their own loans and that hire and train loan officers to do that work. I could talk about law, I could talk about management, I could talk about manufacturing, similar ways to do this. But in sector after sector after sector, we can actually identify what would be the middle-class, mid-skilled jobs that we would need to do that kind of economic activity just as efficiently as we are doing it now, using a small number of super skilled workers.
Lots to think about there in terms of expanding the middle skill area. We have a number of questions here, Daniel, on how your data connects with race and gender. Are they, where
Right.
do your data speak very specifically to those two areas?
Great. Let me say something about gender and then something about race. And they're both really complicated stories, I think, actually. And they're stories of emancipation plus restructured subordination. So on the gender side, begin outside of the elite. One of the things that's happened outside of the elite is that the jobs that women have traditionally done have fared better through the destruction of the middle class than the jobs that men have traditionally done. And so that has produced a state of affairs in which middle-class women are economically faring better than middle-class men. And that's produced a series of tensions in social norms and social behaviors and family structure in America. So much so that, for example, marriage rates and marriage stability have decreased enormously. Outside of the elite in America, for women without a college education, over half of children are now born outside of marriage. Whereas in the top 5% of the income and education distribution, 90% of children are born and raised to adulthood inside of an intact marriage. There are lots of reasons for that, but one of them is that the social norms outside the elite, if you survey people, is that both men and women think that it's important for husbands to earn more than their wives, but middle-class American men do not earn more than middle-class American women. And that produces a lot of tension in the middle-class American family. On the other hand, if you look at the elite on gender, what you have is the following. It doesn't just take millions and millions of dollars to educate a superordinate worker and a super elite kid. It also takes enormous amounts of parental attention. And if you put that demand, which transforms the parent into a production worker, whose product is the next generation of superordinate workers, If you put that demand on a society which is patriarchal, it turns out it's elite women who do that production work. And so in the elite, what you see, if you survey elite Americans, is it important for husbands to earn more than their wives? They overwhelmingly say no, but overwhelmingly elite men do earn more than elite women. And what elite women do is they get educated, they go to professional school, they begin in their jobs, and then when they have the children, they drop out of the workforce. So at law firms, at elite law firms, law schools, half the students are women. Associate classes at elite law firms, half the associates are women. Partners, 15% are women. And one reason for that is that the socioeconomic pressure of producing the next generation of elite people falls on the parents, and when that intersects with patriarchy, it falls on the women who leave the workforce to raise the kids. So that's some gender effects, both inside the elite and outside. With respect to race, the story is also extremely complicated. And I think it's a bifurcation story. This form of inequality and this form of meritocratic competition has been overall very good for elite people of color. Yale Law School has over half of its class people of color now. If you focus on Black prime-aged working men, and you ask where in the white distribution of income would a Black man who is in the 90th percentile of the Black distribution be? The answer was in 1950 below the median. Why? Because overt racism meant that no high-paying jobs were open to African Americans. Today, the Black man at the 90th percentile of the Black distribution would be at maybe the 75th or maybe even the 80th percentile of the white distribution. So there's still structural racism that keeps Black wages down. But for elite Black workers, opportunity is real. And that's because no race has a monopoly on talent and ambition. And so when society opens up the most elite jobs to people based on accomplishments, people from outside of the traditionally privileged groups can do better. At the same time, if you ask, where does the median Black wage sit in the white distribution? It's lower today than it was in 1970. And so this form of inequality has also been extremely damaging for racial equality at the middle of the distribution. And the reason for that is that this form of social and economic organization just massively stretches out the wage distribution. It creates much more inequality. And when more inequality along class interacts with white supremacy, it's people of color, and particularly Black Americans, who are most harmed. And so, as with gender, the race effects are very complicated. And they produce the result that for people of color inside the meritocratic elite, meritocracy has been by and large a good thing. And for people of color as a whole, meritocratic inequality has been by and large a bad thing. And both can be true at once.
Now, the structural racism and potentially sexism issues are obviously a factor in all of this, but a lot of our questions are also asking about sort of the causes. And one from Mark Tambakera's suggests that the data seems to imply that the education gap and therefore the income inequality is caused by rich parents giving an advantage to their children, and they move to elite schools and so on. His question is, how responsible is our public education? And he refers to Scandinavia as an example where the vast majority of children are educated in public schools.
Right.
So is the problem about what we have done in the public school area, the constraints and the limitations that we have put on the capabilities of public schools, how does that factor into this inequality that you're talking about?
Right. So it's a great question. And I think to answer it requires me to at least complicate and maybe reject the distinction between public and private schools in the following way. The distinguishing feature of US American public schools is that they're locally financed. They're financed overwhelmingly by real estate taxes on the houses in each school district's catchment area. That means that the US is one of only 3 OECD countries whose public schools spend more per pupil per year on rich kids than on poor kids. And the differences are enormous. an elite suburban public school might spend 2 or 3 times as much per pupil per year as the national average. That public school funds itself, as I said, through real estate taxes levied on houses in the school's catchment area, where the catchment area is zoned and regulated in such a way that middle-class housing cannot be built. So if you look at Scarsdale, which spends over $30,000 a year per pupil on its education, the median house price in Scarsdale is over $1 million a year. The real estate taxes on that house are pretty close to equivalent to private school tuition. So is Scarsdale High a public school or a private school? Well, juridically, it's a public school, but socioeconomically, it's a private school, where the entrance condition to the school is being able to afford a house in Scarsdale. So if you include those schools as private schools, then what we have is a system in which elite kids, whether they attend juridically or nominally public schools or nominally private schools, have many times more spent on their education than middle-class kids or than working-class kids. And the fact that those schools have been able to concentrate their spending on rich kids contributes enormously to the kinds of inequality I'm describing. Now, there is an enormous movement in the United States to reform public schools to make them more egalitarian. That movement operates through lawsuits, initially under the United States Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, although the Supreme Court shut that litigation strategy down in a case called San Antonio Schools against Rodriguez. Subsequently, through a series of state constitutions. Many state constitutions have adequate education clauses, or state equal protection clauses are understood by state courts to require school finance equalization. And so there have been aggressive and systematic efforts to increase the funding to poor schools more nearly to match the funding that middle-class schools provide. And those have had some success. And if I go back to my screen share, and we just look at this slide, you can see why the gap between an average public school and a poor public school is maybe $4,000 a year. And that's an amount that agitation and litigation can force states to close. But notice, the gap between the average public school and the really rich school is $60,000 a year. And there is no way that a litigation or a school reform strategy focusing on public schools can close that gap meaningfully. We simply aren't rich enough as a society in order for everybody to get the same intensity of education that rich kids get when their parents are allowed to spend as much as they want on their rich kids' education. So that's why when we talked about reforms, one set of reforms that I was talking about were reforms that are designed to force, through carrots and sticks, so to tempt and to force, rich schools to spend less per pupil per year. You know, other societies do this. The Berlin city legislature has enacted a statute forbidding private kindergartens to spend more than a certain modest amount above the state subvention. So gold-plated kindergarten education is not legal in Berlin. There are lots of kindergartens in New York that charge $50,000 a year tuition. And there's no way that every kindergartner in New York can get that education, because even New York isn't rich enough for that.
You know, that brings me to then a number of questions about how are other societies handling this? And so there were questions about Scandinavia, because they always sort of come up in these issues, but there was also a question about China and, you know, what are the trends and the economic and educational trajectories that you're seeing outside of the United States?
Yeah. So unsurprisingly, there's enormous variation, and there's variation in social structure, there's variation in norms and social imaginaries, there's variation in economic structure, there's variation in politics. At the one extreme, there are societies like some of the Scandinavian countries, not all of them, but some of them, and countries like New Zealand, which aggressively promote educational equality, and also, interestingly, promote a form of workplace equality, which has the feature that the army of $1 to $10 million a year salaried workers that drives inequality in the United States does not exist in those countries. So the difference between what a partner at a law firm and what a secretary makes in Finland is much, much smaller. What a shareholder at a university and what a building and maintenance worker at the university makes is much, much smaller. What a doctor makes and what a nurse makes is much, much smaller. Many of those societies actually are quite good at producing super wealthy entrepreneurs. Finland produces almost as many billionaires per capita as the United States. So it's not that these are anti-capitalist societies. Sweden produces large numbers of super rich capitalists. But the labor market and the education system don't produce the mass extreme affluent that the United States produces. So one model is those countries, and how do they do it? They do it by having effectively no private schools, effectively no private universities, and a series of legal, regulatory, and institutional structural labor market institutions that prevent the concentration of productivity and wages at the top of the labor market. Another one that's very important is the German principle of Mitbestimmung, or co-determination. Large German industrial concerns have, by law, a certain number of union representatives on their boards of directors. And what that means is that those industrial concerns are not able to restructure work to strip all but elite executives of the management function. Instead, management remains dispersed across the firm. So there's that class of societies. Then there's another class of societies that does look quite a lot like the United States. Korea is a big example of this. South Korea is a society with incredibly competitive, incredibly hierarchical, incredibly intensive education and labor markets. Some parts of China look like this. Some parts of Singapore look like this. Then there's another set of societies that is still largely in the aristocratic mode. South American societies, several South American societies, are places where the true elite is not the working elite I'm describing, but rather an elite that owes its wealth largely to land or to industrial ownership. So different places are at different stages in this pattern. I think the forces that I describe are universal and are applying everywhere, but of course they're not the only forces in the world. And so they're being countermanded with different degree of success in different places.
Given the structural differences between the examples that you just cited between the US and outside, it's clear that one country's model or one society's model may not necessarily transfer easily to another society. But then we get into that space of what can we do? And Mariana Milkis Edwards has a question about where can we start to create change? Is it through employers who start recognizing a greater diversity of institutions, so moving away from just the elite institutions? Or is it institutions reducing the cost of education and opening up admissions? Because as she articulates, this feels a lot like a chicken and egg situation. Yeah. What needs to go first, and who should be responsible for that?
Yeah. I guess I have three thoughts. The easiest actually is to try to describe the policies that might be useful here. I've described some of them. Changes in the tax regime that governs elite private education. Changes in the regulatory regime that governs financial markets. I think wage subsidies are a much underused and extremely important part of this. So that I did some work a few years back with the city of Birmingham, which was interested in whether it could use wage subsidies rather than real estate tax abatements in its community and economic development plan. The idea would be not to attract new businesses by giving them sweetheart tax breaks on their buildings, which tend to have a relatively regressive effect, but rather to attract the businesses by saying, for every job you create that pays between, say, $30,000 and $50,000 a year, we, the city, will pay $3,000 of those wages. So we'll give you an incentive to create middle-class, mid-skilled jobs. So that's another kind of policy. So we could talk about other policies. There are lots of policies like that. The harder part, though, I think actually is the politics, and that's the chicken and egg problem that the questioner posed, which is that there's an entrenched elite. It has enormous power. And unlike poverty elimination, which can be funded by a small charge on everybody who's not poor, the only way in which we can unwind an oligarchy is by attacking the oligarchs, right? And how do you do that? What's the political economy of it? These are my second 2 points. One point that's very important that I haven't talked about much in this talk, but which I spend some time on in the meritocracy trap, is that this regime is not actually in the human interest of the elite. The elite, you know, we live in a world in which having rich parents is a necessary condition for getting into Harvard, but it's not a sufficient condition. And so rich families and rich kids who want their kids to go to Harvard have extremely stressful and unpleasant lives as children. And then when you get one of these jobs at a partner at a law firm that makes $5 million per partner per year, you are working 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week your entire adult life. It doesn't stop when you make partner. You're 60, you're still pulling all-nighters. So it's not good for the rich. And part of the politics of this has to persuade the rich that if they gave up a third of their income, they could get their authentic freedom back, and that trade is in their interest. That's point 2. And then point 3 is that the politics of this has to be that the political movement has to seek policy changes that, when they happen, further empower the movement rather than producing a backlash. So a good example of that, I think, is a policy change that is designed to induce, through carrots and sticks, elite universities to educate more students and to educate more middle-class students. This is something that, if it were to happen, would not harm the elite, because they could still get their kids in, because the new students aren't taking their kids' places, they're adding places. It would create a new group of graduates of these universities who are committed to the university's social function. And it would render a series of universities that right now are politically and culturally toxic in America, once again, plausibly components of the national public interest, and thereby empower the movement for equality, right? And so the trick is the change agents have to think not just about what they can win, but about how, when they win, they can improve their position to make the next demand.
So there are obviously a lot of questions about change agents and how universities can step into this space, but a couple of still broader questions, and something that you just said about the elite and, sort of this whole lifestyle issue and having better quality of lives. Is there any evidence to suggest, it's perhaps too early to see any data on this, but has the pandemic in any way, you think, influenced a shift towards more well-being, health, higher quality of life? Is there any evidence that you have seen at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's some ways in which the pandemic has clearly been a catastrophe for this, so that elite private schools have just kept going, mostly in person. The Lawrenceville School in New Jersey early on bought 2 mobile testing facilities and tested all of its students twice a week. Didn't shut down. Most rich private schools had 0 days in which the students had no real-time contact with their teachers. The average American public school student has had at least 60 days in which they have had no contact with their school. Not no physical contact, but no contact at all. So they've lost a third to a half a year of education just into the void. And so, whereas the elite have not lost anything. So the pandemic has really put pressure on this system. At the same time, there was a brief moment when the pandemic caused our society in general to see that workers whom it had previously called unskilled should now be called essential. But that moment seems to have passed. And I don't know that there have been long political legs to that recognition. I don't know how optimistic I am. We'll have to see. The mechanism you described strikes me as the most promising, which is that a bunch of elite workers have realized the vanity of their previous rat race and won't want to go back to it. That's possible. The other great possibility is the mass resignation from jobs. That we had a year with universal basic income, more or less, as a society, because of all the stimulus checks. And so a bunch of American workers concluded perfectly rationally that they were not willing to do the jobs that they were being asked to do, just constructed as they were constructed, at the wages that were being offered. And if that movement could generate some labor power, either to force wages up or to make jobs better, or preferably both, that might be a good thing. And let me say just one thing about that. Again, it's really important to understand that the jobs that we now think of as bad jobs don't have to be bad jobs. Think about retail jobs. Retail workers in America today are mostly de-skilled, disrespected, constantly surveilled, manipulated, and very poorly paid. That's because to be a retail worker in a big box store in a massive chain is to have all judgment and discretion taken away from you. You don't do stock decisions. You don't do pricing decisions. You don't provide customer service. You don't do advertising and sales decisions. All you do is help the customer navigate a set of policies and rules and practices designed by somebody else. Retail in a one-shop retail organization is a skilled job where you have to help the customers, you have to decide what to buy, you have to decide how to price it, you have to decide how to provide customer service. And if you read articles in the New York Times in the 1960s, they observe that one storefront skilled retail is much more efficient than mass retail. And it doesn't have to be the case that the only kind of retail that can be economically efficient is this de-skilled subordinating labor market retail. Even today, last thing I'll say, think about Costco versus Amazon. Costco pays its workers maybe twice what Walmart pays its workers, with benefits. It keeps its workers for a long time, and it produces many more dollars of sales per worker than other similar retail chains, because it gives its workers training and discretion.
As you're talking about these particular kinds of jobs that are becoming increasingly underskilled, and then where you were earlier in your comments about the possibilities, what role do you see technology playing in all of this? So there's a general conversation around all things technology about taking away jobs and creating an underskilled category. But what about the possibilities of technology? So can you speak both to where you see technology playing a role for the better or for the worse in this scenario?
Yeah, so right now, as you say, what technology is largely doing is it is substituting for mid-skilled labor and being an economic complement for elite labor. If you think about Uber, it's an example of this. Old-fashioned taxi drivers needed to know the cities they drove in. And so being a taxi driver was a mid-skilled job. The extreme version of this is the London black cab drivers who had to study for 18 months to acquire something called the knowledge. You get in a London black cab, you say, I'd like to go to the Eagle and Child. They say, is it the one in Fulham or the one in Clapham? And then they'll take you there without looking at a computer because they know every pub in the city. But every taxi driver was a mid-skilled worker, and you could make a middle-class living driving a cab. What Uber does is it strips all the skill from the driver and moves it all to the system designer. And the driver simply becomes basically an obeyer of the app's instructions. And with self-driving cars, you'll even get rid of the human obeyer, and they'll just be these. Now, that's not necessarily so. If you call an Uber in Germany, what you get is a licensed taxi driver and a €1 surcharge. So the technology in Germany has been deployed to render the cab hailing function safer and more efficient for both taxi drivers and riders. So you can imagine using the technology in a way that empowers middle-class workers, improves the quality of the service, making it more economically valuable, rather than displacing them. Lots and lots of peer production and coordinated management technologies are like this. The technology that makes Wikipedia possible. Right? The technologies that allow disaggregated, mid-skilled people collectively to produce enormous excellence are much underinvested in. And what's too invested in is the technology that means that Amazon can strap sensors to its workers and know to within 30 centimeters how they're moving their arms and reduce an Amazon warehouse worker to a robot. We can choose which technology to invest in and develop. And that's one of the lessons of the book.
Well, hopefully universities can play a role
Yeah.
in leveraging technology to help create those jobs. In the 15 minutes that we have left here, there are a lot of questions about then what can universities do? And I want to combine two questions here from Dave Gustin and James Wormers. One question is about if elite educational institutions have shaped the labor markets in favor of their style of graduates, how can the purpose, mission, and nature of higher education change to address the issues you're talking about? And the comment that James makes is also equally interesting in that the faculty at a lot of these institutions are trained at elite institutions.
Yeah.
And so you have there's the mission and vision of universities that could lend itself to change, but you have the people within these institutions who also come out of that elitist model in some way. How can then higher education institutions create that change, at least from within where we are?
Right. So I think there are two ways. The first is really to have successful models outside of the exclusive definition of eliteness. I mean, you can think of eliteness in terms of excellence, or you can think of it in terms of exclusion and superiority. And the excellence model of eliteness is that the universities provide the training that is needed to do valuable things well. And there's no competitive element to that. The more people can do valuable things well, the more excellent you are. Whereas the superiority model of eliteness is that what it is to be elite is to be better than others, and therefore is necessarily small and exclusive. Right? And one thing that universities can do is they can develop, this is going to happen probably, Michael's latest book observes this tends to happen outside of the elite, the innovators, is to create models of excellence that are not models of superiority and exclusion. So ASU is looking like this. Georgia Tech, I think, is looking like this. There are a bunch of places around the world that aspire to have that model. So that's one thing to do. Inside the elite, and my view, and this may be navel gazing, but I don't think it is my view is we can't get out of this without also fixing the elite. We can't simply render the incumbent exclusive elite just sort of irrelevant, a sideshow, and just move on. It's too powerful, too big, too destructive. And so the question is how to reform it, understanding, as the question does, that the people inside it have often been trained through it and risen through it and may not be the most eager to be reformed. One thing that is a friend to reformers is that the current level of exclusivity has become so intense and so top-heavy that it's no longer even in the interests of those inside the club. A place like Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Stanford spends so much of its energy chasing exclusivity and then trying in vain to justify how exclusionary it is. Currying favor in various ways, trying to justify the composition of its student body in a much more diverse society than the institution itself can be. That the underlying mission of the university, teaching, research, and learning, is harmed by its own exclusiveness. And it would be much more attractive to be a professor at Harvard if you could just teach and do your research and not worry about whether you were perpetrating injustice or have to justify yourself to all the people who are constantly correctly saying in the press and politics that you're perpetrating injustice. And so the offer to the universities is, look, get out of the exclusiveness business and you'll lose a little bit of status, but you'll be able to get back to doing the thing that you think you wanted to do all along, and you'll be freed up of all the Sturm und Drang and hassle associated with your current privilege. I think that's actually, if you're talking to the faculty, a pretty appealing proposition. If you're talking to the people who sit on the corporation or to the most powerful alumni, it may be a little bit of a harder sell. But to them, I think the sell is your position is becoming politically untenable. You are so rich. You are so disproportionately privileged and powerful that the political branches of our society are going to come after you, and they're going to come after you eventually with pitchforks. And if you don't get ahead of this and render yourself democratically acceptable once again, then a force more damaging than my reform is going to undo you. So reform now. And I think that's a perfectly plausible proposition for those groups.
So you talked about pitchforks. We love pitchforks over here at ASU, but so there could be the threat that you just articulated. What could be on the other side a way to address the same issue with administrators and faculty at universities? So what's the carrot if the pitchfork was the stick?
Well, look, the carrot, look, let me just introspect, and people, you tell me whether you find this is plausible. I became a professor because I love knowledge and I love teaching students, and I love sitting in my study and trying to produce knowledge and think things through and get clearer for myself about things and then communicate it to others. And right now, I spend a third of my time managing the exclusion that my institution imposes on society. Huge numbers of hours dealing with student groups that are disaffected because of disadvantageous exclusion, dealing with administrators, with the broader society I'm in, trying to find a way to address in a decent way legitimate complaints leveled against the form of life and production I'm involved in. And if all of that could be taken away by making it no longer true that my institution is this malign force, I could get back to the things that I joined the profession to do, which is research and teaching. And most university administrators, they did not become deans at Harvard because they wanted to manage the selection of an exclusionary elite. They became deans at Harvard because they were educators. But they're no longer educators. They're now gatekeepers and justifiers about who to let through the gates. And that's not something they wanted to do. And so again, the carrot is you can get back to doing the thing that you care about and that you're right to care about if you could just give up this dependence on exclusionary privilege. I don't know if that seems plausible to you as a kind of argument. I don't know if it seems plausible to the people who are watching and listening and engaging. But I think it's a powerful set of considerations.
It's certainly worth rethinking what identity means for individuals who are elite and institutions who are elite. Carrie Lopez had a question earlier about the identity and the need for shaping the identity of the so-called elites, whether they are individuals or institutions. And it's hard to, I think, give up that sense of identity, the prestige and the status that it affords you, to just give that up in the notion of what almost everybody else can see is the moral good is a complicated thing. Do you think about any of the pieces that you're talking about in terms of change from an identity perspective and what it would cost people to change their identity in some way?
One of the funny things about a certain kind of status is it matters most and sometimes almost exclusively to the people who have it. That as soon as you turn your back on it, you can't understand what the fuss was about. Think about old-fashioned aristocratic status. Think about in Candide, the question is how many quarterings in a lineage does someone have? How many generations back does your nobility go? This is the sort of thing that the aristocrats in the Ancien regime in France spent their whole life obsessing over. And then the bourgeoisie came in and we're like, that's stupid. How could that be something that you would care about? Right? And so I think we're approaching an inflection point on the credentialism in which the status and identitarian obsession with a narrow set of credentials from a narrow set of institutions is beginning to look not just malign, but ridiculous. And it will be easier to give up than people think, especially once some people start arguing for it. I think I have no doubt in my mind. So here's a test case. If my university over the next 5 years tripled its enrollments and became self-consciously democratic and pro-social and concerned with the life of the mind and the well-being of society, it would become less elite as a result and less exclusive. But I have no doubt that a decade in, almost everybody associated with it would be happier than now.
I do want to give you a couple of minutes for your final closing thoughts, but ASU is very self-consciously democratic and anti-elitist in the way we approach education. What role do you think our model here can do to contribute to dismantling some elements of the system that we all agree doesn't really work for anybody else?
Yeah, so that's probably a good place for me to close. Offer some reflections prefaced by the thought that they're provisional and offered without any claimed authority, but just sort of somewhere between reflections and speculations. I kind of think that there are two things that the ASU model can do. The first is, and this is really a political economy point, it can generate a constituency and a power base for a different mode of academic and labor production. Not just show that it works, but then have people who are devoted to it and prepared to vote and agitate and be activists in favor of it. So that you don't have simply a world in which you have a narrow elite and then an excluded group of people who are either trying to get into the elite or destroy it. You have a world in which there's a third group, which is a flourishing, dynamic, capable, charismatic group that is thriving academically and as a democratic workforce without making claims of exclusivity. And that then is a constituency to expand this model. So I think that's the first point. And then the second point is, to show that excellence is possible without superiority or exclusion. And to show it by actually just doing it. I spent some time in various venues arguing that the ways in which exclusive universities select their students aren't just unfair or inaccurate, but are irrational in the technical sense that they could not possibly be picking out things that are genuinely worthwhile. So the idea that somebody who is brilliant at math but does not have a linguistic or visual imagination is an average student, which is what their SAT would show. In the same way in which somebody who is capable at everything all round, but doesn't have flair for anything is an average student. Or the idea that you can combine performance in 11 different subjects into a GPA, which meaningfully captures anything. This is just nonsense. It's not that it's unjust or malign, it may be those things too, but before it's any of those things, it's just nonsense, right? And it's one thing to argue as sort of in a critical mode that it's nonsense. It's another thing to demonstrate and to institutionalize success in academic ventures, not based on that, which is a much more powerful demonstration of the thought that the incumbent regime is nonsense.
What hope are you going to leave us with, Daniel? What final thoughts do you have in the minute that we have about how we can get back to some version of the ideal that we were at in 1929, or however we got there?
Well, yeah, so I do. Look, I do think that we have enormous energy in various sectors of our society, both our workforce and our academic institutions, for building out new models. And I think that the elite institutions are coming to realize that the existing model is not a good one, not even a good one for them. And I think that's happened. I think 5 years ago, the kinds of arguments that we're discussing now would have been viewed as eccentric at best and possibly malign. And I think now, if you were to poll the faculties of Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Yale, the average faculty member would think, yeah, that's right, we got to do something about this. And if you were to look at the students at those institutions, they would also think this is not sustainable. We've got to do things differently. So I think we're at the beginning of a movement to fix this, and in different ways. Some of the things I'm working on and some of the things you all are working on are trying to fix this. So onward and upward.
Well, that is an optimistic note on which to wrap up here, that we are at an inflection point, and there's going to be some significant movement socially in the United States and potentially in other places. Daniel, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, coming over to visit with us, for your presentation and really, really thoughtful discussion here this afternoon. I want to thank all of our participants from the ASU community for your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take all of your questions. We had so many great questions, but hopefully we are all going to walk away this afternoon with a lot more to think about. So Daniel, again, thank you. And we are delighted that we were able to host you here.
Can I just say thank you? Thank you. I can't see the faces of everybody who's participated, but I see the numbers. And so thank you all for taking an hour and a half of your day to engage. Thanks to the questioners. Thank you, Minu. I've been in your shoes before. I have not handled it as deftly and coherently and cohesively as you did. So thank you very much also for running such a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. And everybody be well.